I think a man at the back has asked me to start the session, so I will. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to our panel discussion today. My name's Russell Miller. I'm Director of Learning Solutions and Innovation at Imperial Executive Education, and it's my pleasure to be here today to open this important conversation about sustainability. And not as a bolt-on initiative, but as a core strategic driver that has a power to transform industries within. And we're at a pivotal moment right now. The pressure to address climate change, social inequality, and resource scarcity is no longer external. It's embedded in stakeholder expectations, regulatory shifts, and even investor demands. Companies today are not just being asked what they do sustainability-wise, they're being asked who they are from a sustainability perspective. But embedding sustainability into companies' DNA requires more than just setting ambitious targets. It demands a fundamental shift in how organizations think, behave, and lead. This isn't about adapting greener processes or publishing ESG reports alone. It's about reshaping business models, redesigning value chains, and cultivating a culture where sustainability is everyone's responsibility and not just that of a small team at the top of organizations. So leadership plays a pivotal part in this. Transformational leaders, those who can connect sustainability to long-term value, galvanize cross-functional collaboration, and build teams who are accountable, are key to moving from intention to impact. It's these leaders that care about sustainability and turn it from compliance issues into a source of innovation and resilience. Today, the panel will explore how companies can hardwire sustainability into their strategies, culture, and operations, and how this shift can catalyze change far beyond the boardroom. From reimagining growth to influencing industry standards, the opportunity is not to do less harm, but to do more good. So let's dive in and start with some introductions. Ruth, do you want to go first? Let's go down the panel.
Just a simple introduction?
Yeah, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Ruth Andrade, and I work for Lush Cosmetics. I started working for them in 2004 as the first environment officer, actually coming from the shop floor. I started as a sales assistant, and now a lot of my work is around engagement, culture building, narratives, speaking, marketing, and then I'm part of a bigger team that works a lot on operations, but we distributed the function throughout the business as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Ruth. Seb. I don't think we can hear you, Seb.
Hello, everybody. I'm Sebastian Munden. Everyone calls me Seb, apart from my mum. And I'm the chair of Global Environmental NGO RAP. We work to make circular living a reality in every boardroom and every home. And we've been going about 25 years, originally set up by the UK government, but now a charity working independently across the world. And essentially we work in the food and drink sector, in textiles and fashion, and in packaging materials, working with governments, bringing essentially governments, business and NGOs together to collaborate on system change. That's what I'll probably come back and talk about. My personal background is I worked at Unilever, the consumer goods company, for over 30 years, and I was UK CEO.
I think this works. Hi. I'm Louise Kellerup-Roper. I'm the CEO of a boutique little consultancy and think tank where we work really as thought partners to companies in transition, helping them to co-create shifts, not just for their own business, which every business has to go through a major transition right now, but for their industries and the systems that Seb also referred to. Could I ask a quick question? Could I just check? How many people here work in a big company? Just put your hands up, just so that we have an idea of who we're talking to. That would be helpful. Great. And just one more.
Go for it.
So last night I hosted a little event, and one of the things that came up was feeling like you're a bit of a hostage in a dying system, and there's sort of a gap between what you're doing every day and what you think might be needed in the world. Does anybody feel like that? Yes? No? No? A few? Okay. Just to gauge the room. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise.
So I'm not going to ask any questions right now. So my name is Richard Andrews. I lead the environment, social and governance practice for KPMG in the UK. So what does that mean? It means I've got about 300 professionals helping work with our clients to help them be more responsible and importantly, more sustainable businesses. That's the whole range from regulation, reporting implementation, through to helping people with their strategy, their transition plans, and importantly, getting through to actually executing those plans.
Thanks. And Bemi, over to you.
Yes, I'm Gwemi. I'm an academic at Imperial College London. I'm also the program director for our Executing Sustainability Strategies program. So in that program, we train about 35 sustainability executives or chief sustainability officers every year on how to implement their sustainability strategies, so moving beyond awareness to systemic innovation. And we provide the tools on how to do it in a cost-effective way or how to do it and still generate some form of value or return on investment and improve like the resiliency of the organizations they represent. So we train leaders from the public and the private sector, and a lot of the training is underpinned by some of the case studies and consultancies we do with industry, both for greenfield, so firms looking to just launch on sustainability, and brownfield, so firms looking to transition to a more sustainable future.
Brilliant, thanks. So as you can see, we've got an esteemed panel here today, and there'll be an opportunity for you guys to ask questions of the panel as well as we go through this. But I've prepared some questions for the panel here, and it'd be great if we could start with you, Louise. Actually, I have a question, and Volans and you specifically kind of work with large companies on transformation. What do you see as the conditions for success, and what are the biggest challenges, and how might they be overcome?
Thank you. That's a big question.
It is a big question.
I'll answer a little bit.
Okay.
And I'm sure that everybody else will chip in as well. So in my experience, and again, we work across the world with companies like in infrastructure like Acciona or Unilever in the UK and globally. And it always needs leadership buy-in. So you start there. And I think there is a shift happening because previously there was a lot of, we will just cascade this down. We will make a decision and we will let it cascade through. But more and more, it's really clear that you have to have an ability for people within the company, managers and senior managers to co-create some of this. And often that's not aligned. So in a sense, you need the ownership. So you need to figure out, can you push this through your shareholders? And then how do you put incentives in place for people to actually act on the policies? I think that's one thing. And more in this time of huge uncertainty, where any company that's going to survive, let alone be successful in the next 10 years, will need to innovate. The brilliant thing is that this aligns with innovation, that listening to your teams and allowing them to be more innovative and own sustainability and innovation will increase chances of success. That's my very short answer.
Yeah.
I keep going, but I'll stop.
No, thanks. Thank you for that. Richard, I'd just like to bring you in on kind of your perspective on that. I mean, I guess at KPMG, you kind of see similar types of challenges and issues, but I wonder if you had a point of view around kind of this notion of like sort of cascading and versus building that sort of mid-level leader type sort of engine to kind of make these things really sticky in organizations.
Well, thank you. I'd agree actually with a lot of what Louise was saying. I think it does start in terms of strategy and buy-in. But I guess the classic phrase is that culture eats strategy for breakfast every day of the week. So you really need that cultural change all the way through an organization. So it isn't just buy-in at a board level, it's buy-in at every tier of management. That is through communication, that is through incentives, and incentivizing it through the organization. But it's also culturally communicating actually the value of being a much more sustainable organization and some of those sustainability solutions. And I think that can be challenging at the moment, where there's a lot of negativity around, certainly in the press. But actually, if you look at the facts, the green economy grew 10% last year. I was at an event yesterday. The Lord Mayor of London was saying 880,000 people work in the City of London. 973,000 people work in the green economy in the UK. So it is a huge part of the economy. And in a world where we're looking for growth, actually, this is where transformative growth is.
Mm.
Can I add something? Sorry,
Yeah.
I just realised neither of us mentioned something really, really important. Sorry, Richard, I thought you might do it. It's governance. Is how do you build this into your governance from the top? And that's one of the other things leaders can do. And I noticed Hannah's here from the B Lab, but B corporations have pioneered putting in governance and requirements that you should look after not just your shareholders, but all your stakeholders. So employees, communities, customers, anybody who touches you in the supply chain. And that whole piece on governance is really, really important, which is why, we then come on to regulation. We could do that later.
Yeah.
I just didn't want us to.
Yeah. No.
Pass over
It's a really valuable point. And
Can I add a point as well?
Yes.
I think because of that, of what you said at the beginning, that people right now are feeling that their action is not commensurate with the complexity and the size of the challenge. I think it can be very disempowering if you are in an organization where the leadership has not bought in yet, or where the top leadership are not taking really ambitious action. So I also don't want to underestimate the power of bottom up, internal activism. And we saw with Amazon that we took a group of really committed employees organizing to put pressure in the leadership. So I think that idea of actually activating the internal culture and the supportive environment for some bottom-up influencing, I think is also really important. And that means it doesn't matter where you are in the business, you can do something about it.
Yeah.
You don't have to wait for leadership.
I couldn't agree more. Bemi, do you have a perspective on that? I know from a sort of systemic perspective, that's something that features quite largely in your research and in the Imperial program. Do you have a perspective on from that, how do you do that in practice?
So the systemic perspective is both. So the top down from management and bottom up, but both of them need to be grounded by evidence or grounded on evidence on the benefit of that transition, understanding the dimensions of sustainability, whether it's social, environmental, economics, or profit, planet, people, and really pushing that evidence from both directions. That's what the whole systems kind of piece is about.
Great. And Seb, do you with your perspective from RAP, do you think that is it enough to kind of rely on that, or is there some form of sort of regulatory driver that needs to be put in kind of place to kind of make that happen, or are we kind of sort of a rolling stone where we're gaining momentum now around this, and actually regulation perhaps is less important than it was 5-10 years ago? I don't know. What's your view?
Well, I think it's quite interesting. So up to now, we've talked about kind of how you mobilize within a company, which of course is essential. But one of the things that we work on in RAP is in a way to harness companies that have already decided to mobilize, then start to think about sectors, and indeed think about things that the sector can do when it works end to end, and what the role of government is in that. So just to unpack that a bit and make it very practical. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. The first example I give is if you take UK food and drink industry. We started working on a program, sort of really working with the major retailers in UK food and drink. And it was essentially started with a voluntary agreement around decarbonisation and setting carbon targets. And the idea very simply is that anybody in the sector, wherever they are in the supply chain, can be part of the voluntary agreement. They sign up to the targets, and then they act towards it. Now, of course, we have a very competitive food and drink sector here in the UK, and there's nothing they like more than sort of, getting one up over each other. And so even in sustainability, particularly sustainable sourcing, or sustainable shopping, consumer behaviour. The supermarkets were competing against each other to try and get one up over each other on that. But of course, that doesn't help solve problems when you start to think about the interconnected supply chains and the interplay between carbon and water. and you start to realize that that you need to get all the actors involved in that. So for instance, the work that we do in water around catchment areas around the world, we work in about 9 different catchment areas: South Africa, Peru, Chile, UK, here, Wyandotte, and essentially the areas around water catchment areas is extremely complex because the whole system is only as good as the worst actor in the system. So conventionally, water is really intertwined with carbon because 70% of water consumption is drawn into food and food and drink industry, and of that, a large majority is livestock. So you have the interplay between livestock, and livestock are messy. That's the thing I think all us city dwellers know about livestock. I'm sure it's more nuanced when you're really in the detail, but and that causes pollution in the water, and so trying to then work across the system, but at the same time also working with government. So government's asking, well, what can we do to help? And so I think that mode of action, which is a systemic across all the sectors, thinking about the issues. Some water catchment areas, the issue is about water scarcity, not pollution. Some it's more about pollution, and then working with the local people and charities and NGOs, acting for them to try and create systemic solutions around water. That's the kind of thing that we would do. Bringing this point back to government, though, another good example would be around plastic and the whole sort of packaging materials. So governments across the world bring in something called extended producer responsibility, which essentially shifts the cost of collecting and recycling materials from council tax or municipal tax, citizens paying directly, to the people who are putting the packaging in the market paying. And they obviously can either just suck it up or raise it through the cost of the product. But it's very interesting that you watch that through some of these voluntary agreements, governments can start to signal what their intent is and what it's going to be. And it gives companies a run-up to prepare for it. An example here in the UK potentially would be like the plastic packaging tax. The government indicated, 5 years before the tax came into being, that this was something they were minded to do, which allowed companies to get more recycled plastic into their plastic packaging. Another example, we're doing a project in the moment in Fiji. And in Fiji, essentially, the problem there is that because it's a relatively small island, the economics of collecting that amount of recycling material, that amount of material to recycle, is quite difficult. There's really not enough of it. But it's still a problem. It still has to be collected. So trying to figure out what's the right mix between government action and voluntary action. And that's, for instance, creating more voluntary and community-based collection systems rather than what we would do here in Europe, which is create more government systems which end up on people's tax bills.
So would you say we've got things to learn from the rest of the world?
I definitely think that the governments that are open to listening and interacting with the kind of voluntary agreements, the kind of things that RAP puts together, those governments tend to get better outcomes, I would say, than the governments who think they know it all first.
Yeah.
Do it in a sort of in vitro and then hope that it's going to work.
Sure. Ruth, I know you have a point of view on this.
Yeah, of course. I was also going to say that there is a limit to voluntary targets and agreement. And you can see like Pepsi and Coca-Cola, 2 of the main plastic polluters in the world, that keep going back on their targets, changing the goalposts. Now Pepsi just dropped their reuse targets. And so I think there is a limit to how far like voluntary agreements can go, especially in this changing climate. Just relying on that is not enough. And I think that's why it's important to then pave the way, let this like voluntary agreements just give enough lift so the government can pass legislation without overwhelming, lobbying from the industry. And like France has approved now, reuse targets as part of legislation. I think that's important, because otherwise you're always at the risk that they'll just pull back on their targets.
I think that's exactly right. And that's why I think you can see around INC 5 now, INC 5.2, the trying to get a global plastics kind of rule book. Actually, you see a lot of businesses supporting that. And, at RAP, we've advised governments around the world on INC semi-successfully, I would say, at the moment. But we're all holding out there, because actually getting some ingredients banned from plastic around the world suits everybody. Getting this global rule book is really essential. but actually it's taken years of consensus building even to get to the point where potentially over 100 countries would sign it, and 100 is still not enough.
Yeah, no, Bemi, I kind of guess you have a point of view around this as well. Like when you think about your work at Imperial and helping organisations deliver on kind of the sort of their sustainability initiatives, like how do we make this less of a bolt-on? Because it seems to me that we're kind of moving from like kind of people having sustainability strategies to sustainability being just inbuilt into strategy. So how do organizations make that shift from thinking of sustainability of something that kind of gets done to actually something that is just intrinsic in the way in which they operate and do business?
Yeah, I mean, the goal for us is to move organizations towards having sustainability as a culture,
Mm.
right? And reflected in their business models, in their bottom. And I understand there are several challenges on that journey, going from just being aware of what sustainability means. What we've seen, so we've looked at the sustainability initiatives and strategies of over 100,000 organizations around the world, and most people are doing well on the social aspects and the governance aspects. We're still lacking behind on the environmental aspects, I guess, because it's not really within your boundary. If you have a lot of scope 3 emissions, how do you make an impact in that space? I mean, you can't control the infrastructure for energy and transport, and we're well aware of the challenges, or even the challenges associated with the decision making space. How do you sort of make decisions at the intersection of profit, planet, and people? It's hard enough to make decisions using one sort of degree of freedom, but when you have multiple degrees of freedom, so what we do is sort of to think about a simple things like the language, how you communicate sustainability. So I would say this: whether we embrace it or not, it already affects our businesses, right? So changes in climate, climate disasters, wars, affects energy prices, affects our businesses, how people feel, what's happening, affects employees, sort of morale. It does affect profit. So some organizations are explicit about that sort of relationship, and they're able to be proactive. What we are saying in sustainability to organizations is you have to be proactive. You have to also go a step further to mitigate against this sort of effect so you can be resilient, because these sort of changes will happen more randomly in the next 5 years. Now, I've discovered by training the CSOs and sort of the research we do and the consultants we do with industry, it's down to how you communicate the ambition. So for most organizations, sustainability is seen as something we need to do. So it becomes a burden. We need to be sustainable. We need to do this. And I sort of challenge them to see it as something you can offer, right? So something you need to do, you list all the initiatives, we need to materiality assessment, we need to do this. But if you think of it as something you can offer by doing these things you need to do, then that's where the competitive advantage is. And that has really helped to embrace that term. Think about what you can offer by being sustainable.
Great, thank you. Richard, I guess in your work you kind of you see some of this stuff playing out on a kind of a weekly basis, right? What are some of the practical things that you can kind of help us understand in terms of what does that mean in reality for organisations, and how do they overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, I was just going to build on that offer, and I think often it is, how do you see sustainability as an opportunity?
Yeah.
And we were talking before we came on the stage as, actually, how do you see it as an opportunity that if you don't take it in the next few years, actually you'll look back and look at your competitors who did take that opportunity and are successful and you aren't. So we launched a report yesterday called Reframing Sustainability, and then I went to the Net Zero Delivery Summit and I heard speaker after speaker use the phrase reframing. So I thought we'd probably got our title right. But I think it's really important in terms of how you think about and talk about sustainability. And the idea of reframing is to move away from it being a impact, I must do it. And yes, we must do it for the good of our people and the planet. But actually to move away from just that as the driver into thinking about, actually, this is a core commercial opportunity and driver. And that could be as simple as, if I look at my energy costs, can companies that use less energy spend less on energy, and actually that will drop to the bottom line. Companies that move to their own renewable energy, whether that is solar in their own premises, actually create resilience in terms of their energy supply, and often actually reduce the long-term cost of that energy for their organisation. And you could go through. There was it was a highways project in the UK looking at decarbonising the cement that was used in the highway they were building. They took big project. They took a huge amount of the carbon out, which was the right thing to do for the planet. They also saved the taxpayer £13 million because actually it was cheaper to do it that way. And you got a highway that was just as good as you would have got otherwise.
Ruth, do you have a perspective on that? I think, is your mic on?
Yeah, I'm just turning it off to save battery.
Why?
I've been in this movement for most of my adult life, and we are where we are, and we haven't even picked emissions. So I think it's really important that we, when you talk about reframe sustainability, that we really think deeply as to why change has not been fast enough. And I think it's because we keep using words we don't understand. No one understands decarbonization or net zero, like the general people in business, like communities. And I think we are trying to mitigation language. A lot of this has this cloud of impenetration that I think disconnects people. And I just want to go back to the fact that we're social animals, that social licensing is probably the most important thing for us to make decisions. And that, I will probably take an action if my neighbor is also doing it, or if my immediate family are also doing it. So actually talking about the problem, humanizing the problem, saying how we're actually already being affected, how, at Lush, we're seeing really problems in the supply chain, the quality of raw materials, cocoa butter, our main natural material. Imagine that your top one material in your business goes up in price 6 times in 1 year. Oh. Those are actual, problems that we can deal with as humans. And I think the other is the importance of narrative and storytelling. And I think something we've done quite well at Lush as well is working on lifting the stories for staff and customers in ways that are engaging. Like we use a lot rewild your routine to talk about raw materials that are also protecting biodiversity. And you're seeing the camera trap of a pregnant spotted jaguar on the land that your Brazilian oil comes from, that goes into conditioner. So I think that connection, really deep connection of people into the stories, is how we create a movement. And I think dropping a little bit all the jargon and just saying how anxious we all are that our future is so uncertain. Yeah.
Louise, what have you seen that kind of works about building on sort of what Ruth says around narratives and stories? Because I know that's something that you're very passionate about.
Yes.
I'll come to you in a moment as well.
I think that's a really, really important point, because there is this issue of disconnection, and if we Bemi and Richard are absolutely right. There are lots and lots and lots of opportunities to cut costs and new opportunities and innovation in sustainability. But actually, I'm now working with pioneering companies who've done all that. They're not finding that their customers are asking for this. Let's be really clear. When you ask consumers, for the last, I think 20 years ago, did a consumer survey, and more than 60% said they'd pay more, but most of us won't, whatever. And I think that's, so we have to find other ways. I emphasize there are lots of opportunities, but really I think we've moved into a world of resilience and risk when we come from the business angle, that whether we believe in sustainability or not, or ESG or whatever we want to call it, the fires are going to be worse. The floods are going to be worse. Social anxiety, upheaval is going to be worse. And so when you take that lens onto your business, now what are you going to do? And working with boards, it's really interesting, because I have never come across a board really that responds well to opportunity. They are focused on risk.
Yeah.
And I think we need to do that. Plus the risk of everybody here who has a job not being happy is also, and so linking connections at every level, remembering that board members, leaders, etc., are also human, but linking up within companies, activating that, educating that. And there are some brilliant tools. There's Herd, which I don't know if you've come across it. It's an app that you can basically train your employees. You get little micro lessons in sustainability specifically for your job. Very easy, but that's the connection. We've got to get to that.
Yeah, thank you. Seb, I know you had a comment.
So Ruth's point is spot on about the sort of storytelling and narratives. I wrote a book about it's called Sustainable Advertising, how advertising could help support a better future, and I think the expectation of consumers and citizens is it's our job in industry to sort the problems out. They expect us to know what the issues are and to fix them, and then tell them how good our products are. And I think, if I draw back on my Unilever experience, I ran the laundry products business in Unilever for several years and was involved in it for more years before that. And one of the things that I think really had in our minds was, we understand the chemistry of laundry. We understand we've got to move from fossil fuel chemistry to plant-based chemistry. And that's what customers expect. They don't want a chemistry lesson. They just want to buy Persil. They expect us to fix it. And that's why, and of course you do have, acceptance issues. And one of the biggest acceptance issues that I worked on over my period was dosing. When I started, you used about 200 mil of Persil, in the, early 90s. That's like a soft drink kind of quantity. And now it's 20 mil. It's reduced by 90% over about 25 years. Why 25 years? Well, of course, there was some kind of learning as you go, but actually that was about customer acceptance. People thinking, well, I can't possibly do that much, if it's so little. So yes, of course, you've got to work with that. But in the end, we had to own the fact that we were doing a chemistry transition. And we understood what that meant. And of course, coming to Richard's point, you then have to bake that in. Every time you do a product relaunch, you'll save some money over here. You'll invest some money on your plant-based over here. It might cost a little more per gram. So you've got to really make sure that the savings work. But also, I can't think of many projects that we did for sustainable chemistry reasons or sustainable energy reasons, that didn't also save us money and improve margin.
Yeah. No, interesting that kind of perspective around perception around small dosing, sort of being less effective than a large volume.
Yeah, and that took. I mean, it really took 20 years, and luckily, not just us, but also our competitors who fiercely compete against. But luckily, we were all saying similar things, which is you've got to trust the dose. But in the end, you're overcoming kind of very deep instinctive thoughts about, if I'm going to spend a tenner, big is good.
Yeah, it's a simple metaphor, but a very effective one. You might have seen me looking at my phone a minute ago. I wasn't checking my Facebook or my TikTok account. I was keeping an eye on the time, and I want to give you guys the opportunity to ask some questions of the panel, and maybe I can start by kind of just asking you, what good examples have you got? Where have you seen this work? Some of the organizations you work for, what good examples have you got where you've brought this to life in a systemic way?
Somebody must have a good example or a bad example.
Yeah, or a bad example or a challenge. Feel free to raise a hand. No examples? Okay, well maybe we'll give you some examples in that case then. So what have we seen that's worked? What if you had to kind of sort of sum this up in kind of one sentence, what are the kind of key ingredients would you say need to be in place in order to really drive sustainability from kind of not just the top down, but throughout organizations? Ruth, maybe I can ask you for your point of view on this one first. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I think at the moment we need everything, so all solutions are on the table. It's an and, not an or situation. But I'll share, I think talking about culture, and is for me the most important thing, is how do you really create that culture where, despite the pressures and despite the economic pressures and the changing political environment, it's embedded enough in the organization that people will seek to make the right decisions, for all the stakeholders. And I think something we've been using at Lush for a long time is getting people close to those that are suffering the consequences of the problems that we're creating as a business entity. And I think that has always been good to bring climate activists into the business, indigenous folks to speak directly to our shop staff, having events where we actually invite civil society to share how they are. We've just done something called the Spring Prize, which is a prize for regeneration, and our staff actually get to interact and talk to many grassroots organizations that can tell firsthand stories, and then it becomes personal. And I think making it personal and making it really part of the identity of the business and the culture, I think it's the spark, right, that ignites change.
Thank you. Bemi, can I just ask you, for in the work that you do at Imperial, particularly around the executing sustainability strategies kind of program, what are some of the good examples that you've seen from that program of organizations that they're actually doing, that have some great ideas and they're executing them well? And what are some of the key kind of characteristics that you see of those organizations that do a good job of this?
The ability to apply systems thinking
Okay.
on an organizational level. So we've seen it for Roche, we've seen it for Sky Diamond in the UK, we've seen it for BP, we've seen it for Ecotricity, just trying to understand the sort of intersections and how to create value, but understand the risks at that point.
Brilliant. Seb?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's vital is that sense that the organisation is going to do better when it has all its stakeholders in mind, and for me that's the foundational idea. If when I go and talk to a company, either in my private consulting or with one of the NGOs I work with, I'm always, the first thing I'm trying to smell out is, does this organisation understand that its future success is completely tied to the well-being of the communities in which it's based, the employees who are working there, and the sort of broader stakeholders? Because companies who really get that, I think that there is a much easier place for them to go to. Well, what's a version of the future where we're successful as a company, and the community is still thriving, the environment around us is not completely destroyed, and what's that version of the future? And I think that's how you get into the point that Rich and Bemi were making earlier, which is you've got to start with strategy. But how do you start with strategy? How do you get to a strategy conversation, as opposed to having the CSO has a sustainability strategy, in which case you're completely stuffed because it's not connected to the company's strategy. And no successful person I've ever come across has 2 to-do lists. So the way to get a company or an organization into understanding that this has all got to be in their strategy is through a stakeholder understanding of their context, and then saying, so let's eliminate now, to raise the bar, we'll eliminate all possible ideas about our future that don't also kind of grow the sort of employees, establish more love in the community, and are better for the environment. We're just going to rule out those versions of what we could be and really think harder to come to the version which aligns all those interests. And that's the route in.
Thanks. And Richard?
I was just going to say, I do think over the last few years you've actually started to see this come out. If I might call it the CISO pillar, or CSR turned into sustainability officer, and actually it has become an all board or all executive committee issue. And part of that is regulation, which has helped bring it onto the agenda of the CFO and the CEO in a different way. But also it's been starting to see, actually, if you are to make that change, it needs to be an all of company change. You can't just do it in one place. One thing we talk about is ESG as the watermark through everything we do, and embedding it into all of our projects. But if I might put something else on the table.
Go for it.
I think one thing to think about is timeframes. And Seb, you mentioned 25 years to to get things down 90%. I think one of the other things we need to think about is timeframes for thinking about investment. So quite a lot of these initiatives need quite a large upfront investment. And it's how do you start to articulate that payback, possibly over 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and articulate that to often, certainly in a listed environment, companies that are reporting on a quarterly basis. And I think one thing there where we do need some more thinking is how do you start to articulate that longer term investment payback and return on the investments that people are making. And I can see people looking at watches, so I will go back. I will go back to you, Russell.
Rob's just given us the sort of 10-minute kind of to go kind of mark, so we're in good shape. But I just wanted to follow up on that actually, Richard, and sort of just, and it's a difficult question to kind of answer, but where do you start with this? So it always used to be start at the top of the house and cascade it down, but I'm not sure that's necessarily the case of where we are in the world of sustainability now. So, like when you work with organisations or even within KPMG itself, like where's the kind of the place that you start? Is there a particular function or level that you kind of think, right, if I'm going to get this going, where do I go to?
So I'd say we start at both ends.
Okay.
So we have a lot of thinking that is cascading down from our executive committee. It is owned by individual members of our executive committee and have responsibility for that. We've also launched, a few years ago, we launched something called Leaders 2050, which was a group of young professionals coming through our organisation that we expect to be the leaders in the world in the year 2050 as they're coming through. They're actually leaders now. They are a brilliant set of individuals. And what's really been exciting about that is the ideas that network of people just starting out in their careers have brought, new ways of thinking, but also the level of collaboration. So that's grown from a group of a few hundred in our company to a cross-company initiative that has over 3,500 people across 200 companies.
Yeah. Brilliant, Seb.
Just in looking at the ad industry and sort of marketing in general, the thing that really struck me profoundly is the internal dissonance and the stress that causes when you're working in a company and you feel profoundly misaligned to the views of that company. So I think it's definitely worth thinking about that. This is essentially as a kind of employee proposition, and and therefore, if you want to attract those kinds of people into your company who are going to, invent the future and innovate, there are to keep them, you have to run the company in a particular way, and you have to be totally consonant with doing that. And therefore, it really is important to get that employee proposition right. Otherwise, you'll just see the people you really want to stay leave, and the people who you may think, well, why are they still here? That because so you get the wrong mix. So I think it's really important to understand that it's a fundamental part of your pitch to come and work wherever it is.
Agreed. We have a question from the floor. Would you mind just kind of introducing yourself very briefly before you pose your question?
Amy Whittle. I work in ESG reporting at BP.
Brilliant.
And my question is, so you start at the top and the bottom, but how do you get have you seen anything working to get the cross functions working together? So how do you make sure finance and technical experts and how do you get all of the people working towards a common goal across functions?
Great. Louise, do you want to take
Yeah, thank you for asking a question. Hurrah! So the times I've seen it work best is experiments. Really, and this is something obviously the leadership has to allow, but allowing small experiments of cross collaboration, and you could really could just be interested parties, people who feel the most strongly, but to pick something really concrete so that you can work on together. And you may not have found that when you first gather. And I love the idea of a network that has been charged with it, but it doesn't have to be. And allow yourself to experiment, not just to get to a certain innovative outcome, but how you want to work. Because it's the thing that often gets forgotten. We talk about culture, and yet we still turn up for meetings in the same way. So then there are lots of more fun ways to have meetings, right? And actually you'll get better results. So allowing small experiments where people then, when they finish, they take some learnings, and some failings too, into each of their teams, and with them they take a network that can support them on the way. And from an employer point of view, it works really well, because back to a massive dissonance and this feeling of you're doing business as usual and yet the world is burning, and you kind of, you're not marrying the two up. So it means you develop your people, you develop the ideas that will impact the rest of the business, and so on. So I was going to say that, for me, that's that. Somebody else might have an idea.
I just want to add, so we've done it through like cross-organizational training. So what you call experiments, we also do built around like case studies that are relevant to the organization. So for BP, case studies relevant to BP for the next 5 years, 10 years, and you just bring teams from the high, middle, low, from different departments, so they understand purpose in delivering that sort of vision.
Yeah. Thanks, May. Ruth, from a Lush perspective, I know this is something that you guys do kind of internally. So how do you tackle it?
Yeah, I think one thing that has been interesting is we've taken this concept of a finance business partner or a people partner and created this idea of an environmental partner. So every department has an environmental partner. They either is working in the earth care team or is actually fully embedded. Like my colleague is here, and she basically moved into the property team to be working very closely with like leadership within property. And then we have someone working really closely with manufacturing or with digital or with buying. And I think having that, just having the technical expertise working alongside leadership in those business functions has been really helpful, because then we can also translate all the data back into really actionable, practical ideas in partnership with the leadership.
Thanks, Seb. I know you have.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, which is until you actually start influencing the business decisions, whichever department they're in, whether it's in marketing or finance, you're basically an advisory function as the CSO department, and of course that's good, but it's not enough. And so what you've described in Lush, Ruth, is one really tried and tested. I've seen that work in many companies now, where you have an environment aware or trained partner for all the business decision makers, because it brings it to the right point of view. It brings those considerations into the room. But the other way you can do it is to make sure that the key decision makers have been suffused in the culture. And coming back to Richard's point about you kind of got people to have to just think about it and ask the question, what is the implication on this for our greenhouse gas footprint or our nature footprint. And you can do that through culture as well.
Brilliant, thank you. So I've just been given the 5 minutes warning. Last opportunity for questions. There's a gentleman there. Let me just give you my mic. Somebody can get me another mic.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Great panel. Actually, very excited to see this. So I'm Sunil Ramakrishnan. I'm a consulting partner at Tata Consulting Services. Work with large organizations across UK on sustainability. My question is more around the retail sector, where we see a lot of cost pressure on large retailers need to bring in quarterly financial improvement in their P&L. So with such cost pressure, how are you seeing that sustainability could be included in the decision making, which typically takes a longer term view versus most of the retailers at the moment focusing on a quarterly basis?
So I'm going to ask Seb to comment on that first, and then bring in Ruth. And just mindful, we've only got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah.
But Seb, do you have a perspective? I guess from your Unilever days, that might be.
Well, also with the work we're doing with the food and drink industry here in the UK.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think there are two. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is get short-term wins as well as lay the foundations for things that take a bit longer. The short-term wins, quite honestly, around supply security and margin. And so, putting to the front of the queue those projects which are, because they're reducing waste, they're also, margin accretive, and particularly around supply security, which is an everyday risk. And so that's, if you like, bouncing off the real, kind of climate threats. I think then that buys you space for the longer term projects. But again, even the longer term projects, it's showing that they have a commercial future, and are going to keep, retain, and excite customers. And I think what a lot of NGOs are learning is how to bring that extra commerciality in to the proposal.
Thanks. And Ruth, would you mind commenting just from a Lush perspective? Your retail business.
I mean, Lush is a very different business. Like, we really have a very carefully planned supply chain that doesn't fluctuate every quarter. But I think to say, start where, like, very similar, where you can add value, like where there are multiple values to be gained from that initiative, because you're saving costs, it's more efficient, you're driving perhaps better customer value, better storytelling, you're uplifting stories that the brand or a marketing team can use. So I think really starting with stacking functions, as we say, and stacking benefits. And then I think the second thing is, like, well, I'll give two examples. One is really looking at where are you spending most money. That's highly likely where you can actually make the most impact. So even a very small change into where you're spending the most money, and sometimes that won't even increase costs, I think it's a good place to start, because then you get some scale of change, which I think is also important. And the last thing is there are indirect ways that we are all contributing to a dysfunctioning, climate. And one of them is, for example, how we're investing our money and even how we're banking. And at Lush, we had like a brain wave. Like, we were at a meeting discussing divestment, and it's so hard to move banking in the high street. And we said, why don't we just move the cash reserves? Like, at Christmas, we're generating so much cash because that's when the bulk of sales happen. Let's just do that. Let's just take from a bank and move our cash reserves to Triodos. So every third day, we move the cash to Triodos. That alone has already reduced the carbon footprint of our banking significantly, and it literally didn't take anything, right? So being very creative about how you think about downstreams and upstream impact, I think, is the other thing to do.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you all, panel, for your contributions today, and thank you for the questions that have come from the floor. You've been quite shy, so if you do have questions that are burning, but you kind of want to ask any one of us on the panel, we'll be around for at least the next kind of half an hour or so. Come find us, and happy to answer any of your questions one-on-one. If you want to find the Imperial stand, that's always a good place to kind of come and have a chat to me, and I can grab any of the panel. We're on D720, so feel free to come by and say hello. I want to be respectful of the conference organisers and the time we have available, so I'll wrap things up here. But thank you very much for your time and your energy today.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks, everyone.